Right, welcome to the next episode of the Delivery Pod, which is all about B2B deliveries in our city. If it's the first time listening to the pod, I'm Kevin Savage.
And I'm Nicholas. Hi, everyone. As a reminder to everyone that's listening, this podcast is structured around three key ideas. These are the pillars that are changing last mile delivery. We've talked about this in a few other episodes, but to remind everyone, the first is that the world of e-commerce is accelerating, and we have more packages, and in this case, food, being delivered into our cities every day. The second is that our cities are fundamentally changing, with cities kicking out motorized vehicles and incentivizing pedestrian and cycle usage. And the third is that consumer demands are changing. And so what used to be a kind of a 5-day expected delivery is now 4 hours, or in today's scenario, probably 1 hour delivery. And so because of these changing factors, the way and the when of last mile delivery is fundamentally changing. And today we're going to talk a little bit less about parcel and much more about food, but that does tie into elements 1 and 3.
Yeah, so to help guide us through all of this, I'm delighted to give a warm welcome to Michael Strange, who's the director at Just Eats for Business. Michael's going to help us run through the ever-changing world of business deliveries in our cities, really. Just as a bit of an intro, and I'm sure he'll tell me what I've got wrong, has spent the last 6 years in delivering food in our cities. During that time, he was in a small startup called City Pantry, where it was, I think, 7 people. Those 7 people then became lots of people. Mike took on the customer service element in that as well. City Pantry then was acquired by Just Eats, a well-known name that people will be familiar with. But Mike works in the Just Eats for Business, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Mike describes himself, and I'm sure you'll tell me, as loving data, and I can probably know Mike, so I would say that's true. He likes to coach other people, and he likes to optimize processes. So I think that we'll get into all of that in the changing cities that we're in today. So, Mike, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to come and join us on this podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so perhaps we can talk about the different types of food deliveries. So I myself, as a consumer, I'm used to going online and ordering some food for home, and that's fine. But that's not the world that you live in during your working day, in any case. So perhaps you can help the listeners by just describing where the two come differently within the food delivery sector.
Sure, I'll give it a go. I suppose you've got your typical consumer delivery, which all of us are familiar with, and it's an individual maybe ordering a burger in the evening for them and a partner. It's pretty fast. It's a really small basket size, maybe about £20 on average. Whereas I work on the business side of things, which is more so a company is processing the payment. They're the one that is subsidizing the food for their team or employees. So that could be anything from meeting food to a recurring team lunch to a celebratory pop-up once a quarter when they hit a milestone. But the key theme around it is that the payment is actually being subsidized by the employer. So it's for team engagement, culture, and bringing people together.
And so whereas a normal delivery might be, to your example, a single burger on someone's back, this is probably for teams of 20 or 30 people. And so you're talking about much larger quantities of food. Can you tell us about how that delivery is typically done?
Yeah, exactly. The order profile varies massively. So it could be still a £20 order for an individual who's working late in an office, all the way up to £2,000 for a couple hundred people and everywhere in between. As a result of the really wide order profile that you have, you need a lot of different delivery options. Anything from motorbikes, cargo bikes, cars, vans, splitting those orders across different vehicles where necessary as well. So working with a number of different vehicles and partners to get it from restaurant to customer.
Okay. And one of the key themes of this episode or of this series is that increasingly it's hard to do deliveries with vans, for instance, because of the way our cities are changing. And so, are you seeing an evolution in that fleet portfolio that you just described? Is it tending towards a different kind of vehicle?
Definitely, yeah. I would say 5, 6 years ago, almost all of the deliveries were happening petrol powered cars and vans. And that has massively changed, especially post COVID. Not only are those vehicles way more expensive to run now, but they're finding it harder to park, and customers are demanding a change in the vehicles that are delivering to them.
That's great. And Mike, one of the things I think which will help the listeners understand is that obviously food on larger orders, does that always come from one place, or could it come from several places to one delivery point?
Yeah, great question. Several places. If you're ordering for 200 people for a recurring team lunch every Wednesday, for example, it is rare for all 200 people to agree on the same restaurant. As I'm sure you know, it's hard enough if you're with a group of friends of 10 people. So you typically want a few different restaurants in order to cater for the different dietaries and tastes of the team. But also, you want all that food to arrive at the exact same time. And so if you're doing that from a single restaurant, by the time they've made the last portion of food, the first one's going to be cold. So often you want to split that across multiple restaurants. And so typically each restaurant might be serving anywhere between 30 to 50 heads. Anything more than that, unless you're working with specialist partners, they're going to struggle to have it all ready at the same time in a good quality.
And so as part of your software, the kind of the thinking through, okay, how do we, one restaurant is further away than the other one. How do we make sure these orders all arrive at the same time?
Yeah, to an extent. So customers get to choose whichever restaurants they want to put forward to their employees. But then I would say that mostly we leave it up to the experts in delivery to determine whether they're going to batch orders or pool orders, put it on separate riders, or have one rider collect them all together for example.
Okay. And we were talking about this a little bit before we kicked off today. Can you tell us about the different who's actually doing this delivery? Is this largely people from Jet, or are you outsourcing to other people? How does that work?
Yeah, we have a number of different methodologies of having the food delivered. And because of the wide profile, we work with a number of different outsourced third-party partners in order to get that. So some of those might be motorbike specialists, cargo bike specialists, or van specialists, for example. And then there's also a number of orders which might actually be delivered by the restaurants themselves if they are capable of doing so and they've got particular expertise and have demonstrated that they meet our expectations.
Okay. And sorry, this is something I like to go on and on about every episode is, historically, I think we've had a kind of a single vehicle fleet where everyone just had cars and that was the solution. I think increasingly we're getting better at optimizing for, given this size, use this vehicle, or given this distance, use this vehicle. Is that a big part of your offering as well, of this kind of optimization of given order, therefore use this vehicle?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're collecting the information from restaurants all the way to the point where they're uploading their items onto the menu and the customer's placing the order, we're collecting data points throughout that entire process. So that could be, are those particular menu items fragile? Maybe it's cupcakes. Is there any alcohol in the order or glass? Are any particular items oversized? So if you're talking massively large 20-inch pizzas, for example, we're collecting all that information throughout the menu upload process so that when the customer is placing the order, we have all the data points to know which partner to send it to and to provide those data points to the partner so that they can choose the right vehicle, the right rider, because it can be, as you say, it's not only what vehicle are they on, but some riders, for example, will say that they don't want to deliver alcohol, and that's absolutely fine. And so it's just really important that we collect those data points.
I think that's really interesting, Nicholas, because remember in the first episode we talked about this way that things just get delivered. And I think just explaining and walking that through is there's a much more complex world behind food delivery than even I knew coming into this podcast today, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Michael, just to pick up on one of the pieces is that you talked about COVID. Yeah, and we know that COVID has changed a lot of things. Can you talk us through what that's meant to your business? What data points are changing? What things you see now and in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely, it changed a lot for the world, of course, but it also changed a lot in the food delivery space and for us particularly. On the B2B side, as we all experienced, offices closed for a significant period of time, which was really problematic for us as a food delivery business that primarily delivers to offices. Fortunately, we were able to respond very quickly to that, and we rolled out kind of a number of different products that allowed employers that wish to provide actually food delivery to residential homes across the UK so that they could continue to celebrate particular things and celebrate milestones by sending food packages from our restaurant partners all across the whole of the UK. As we've started to come out of COVID, you've seen that complete change. Offices have reopened. At the beginning, it seemed very slow, and obviously, we have completely changed from the typical 5-day working week. You now see people working from home 2 to 3 days a week is quite typical. And at first, perhaps that was a concern that it's never going to go back to what it was. But what we've actually seen is loads and loads of businesses that maybe didn't order food before are now needing to think much harder than they ever did about culture, about team, about bringing together the different communities within their business and really incentivizing and encouraging people to come back to the office. And there's no better way to do that than food. It brings everybody together. Everybody has a reason to go in. And it means when you're there and actually eating, generally it's not about grabbing your lunch and sitting at your desk, but rather about sitting with your team, sitting with other teams, and fostering different relationships across the business.
I think I finally went into the office on Tuesday, and it's because we had a work lunch.
There you go. See,
you're spot on.
And is that changing during your week in the patterns? I know a lot of people now are on like hybrids and 3 and 2 or 2 and 3. Are you seeing that changing in your order patterns, and how are you coping with that?
Definitely, yeah. Before COVID, I would say that the busiest times would be breakfast on a Monday to get everybody into the office to kick the week off, and then towards the end of the week, you got a lot of pizza Fridays and that kind of thing to wrap up the week. What we see now, as I'm sure you guys are experiencing as well, is generally Mondays and Fridays are often work from home days. People get kind of an extended weekend at home by doing that, and therefore Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays are pretty big.
And what pressures does that put on?
Yeah, it means that it's quite peaky, essentially. It's perhaps an industry term, but all the orders are just consolidated into a very narrow time period, not only in terms of days a week, but also during the day as well. So it's really difficult, as I'm sure you'll be able to attest to keep a fleet engaged when you've really only got your Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays having the majority of your volume. And then also on those days, you're really talking about lunch deliveries primarily. Some companies order breakfast, some companies order afternoon snacks or evening food, but without question, as most of us experience, we're in the office at lunchtime. Generally, we don't like to be in the office for dinner time.
Great. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm experiencing it, and as like Nicholas, I come into the office a couple of days a week, and food is a great thing, and I'll testify to that.
Yeah, and maybe to give Michael a breather, I might flip the question over to you, Kevin. You know, this podcast is usually centered on parcel delivery, so delivery of goods as opposed to delivery of food. But couriers and last mile delivery experts are delivering a pretty wide variety of things these days. And so, how does food fit into your ecosystem at Delivery Mates?
Yes, I knew you'd ask me this question eventually. No, food is a very important part. Food, as Mike says, is a peaky piece around lunchtime. Yeah, there are bits out of the side, but around lunchtime, you've got to have enough fleet available to be able to satisfy that demand. And that demand is partly pre-planned, but is changing right up to the order basket being completed. So what would fit on a bicycle will now only fit on a cargo bicycle. So you've got to have the agility and flexibility to be able to do that. And you can only do that with the economies of scale and having enough people out on the road. So what we've been doing over the last 12 months is putting more sustainable cargo bikes out on the road, and probably delivering in a cargo bike when traditionally you could have done it on a motorbike, a motor scooter. So that's how we're coping with it. And then we're filling the morning and afternoon slots with different types of product, different types of deliveries. We talked about parcel deliveries, but you could do a parcel delivery in the morning. As long as the vehicle's clean and free, then you can do a food delivery in the lunchtime period, and then you can flick on to pharmacy delivery or other parcel deliveries in the afternoon. And the idea then is somebody had this term Manhattan skyline. So we've got different peaks all over. The job as a logistics company is to try and flatten that as much as possible, so that you've got some kind of consistent work across all of our riders and our fleet.
And so to dumb that down for our audience, some things need to be delivered in the morning, some things need to be delivered in the evening. If you own a vehicle and you only deliver one thing per day, you're not optimizing the use of that vehicle. And so you need to find a blend of products that you deliver that will maximize the usage of that vehicle and that delivery person throughout the day. Is that right?
That's absolutely right.
Okay, that's the Manhattan skyline.
That's the Manhattan skyline, just flattening it down.
I like that.
Okay, good. And I suppose really moving on, and we've got all the peaks and demands. We've got those partners that we need to do. We've got multi pickup points. That's all quite complex. And I imagine the first thing people are saying, can I have choice, can I have service, and can I have cost? Where does sustainability come into this, Mike? Because we talk a lot about sustainability. We know that changing cities is all about decongestionising. Where does it fit into customers, suppliers, and yourselves?
Yeah, it fits in pretty high, I would say. Not only as a business do we have sustainability targets, net zero by 2030, and we're doing carbon tracking of all the emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3, for example. So it not only fits into our own internal targets, but also increasingly we're seeing that our customers are actually asking for it as well. On the B2C side, I can comment less, but I think it's a lot about brand alignment. But what's super interesting on the B2B side is the companies that we're working with have their own sustainability targets, and they need to ensure that anybody who's a supplier or within their own procurement chain is aligned with the values that company has. So we need to make sure that we're ourselves meeting the sustainability goals of all the partners that we're working with. So it's not only about what our goals are, but we very much need to be an approved supplier for all the different companies, corporates, and SMEs that we're working with as well. And I would say, again, 3-4 years ago, it was reasonably rare for sustainability to come up in sales pitches and conversations, whilst now it's one of the first things that we're being asked is essentially, what are you doing to ensure that we're being sustainable? What are you doing about food waste? What are you doing about plastic packaging? What are you doing about emissions? What are you doing about food choices? So there's definitely sustainability on the environmental side. And what's really great to see is that people are also now asking about other things beyond just the planet. They're also asking about food, and they're asking about people and communities as well, and how we're a part of the community that we're working in.
That's great to hear. And it kind of points to another distinction between the B2B and the B2C side, where, I have Deliveroo, Uber Eats, Just Eat, a variety of different options on my phone, and I might jump between the two quite easily. It sounds like the kind of setup process with a company is much more serious. They're kind of doing due diligence on who you are as a company, and then once you're in, you're probably in. Is it a stickier space?
Yeah, definitely much stickier. It is the case that you can just go on the website and place an ad hoc order and theoretically swap between, but it tends to be that because there's a larger emotionality to the transaction, because you're ordering for a group of people. Generally, once you've got a provider which is going to be reliable, have the tech, and depending on the kind of company you are, have the data security that aligns with your own company, you're probably going to stick with that provider. In addition, what's very different about B2B is the account management side of things, and ensuring that you have someone who understands your business, what are the food tastes, and is really recommending the latest restaurants that fit to your dietaries and fit to your company culture.
So it's a much more hands-on sales experience.
Yeah.
You have people personalizing the offer. It's much more human.
Yeah, much more human.
Interesting. And then when you think about profitability, and we don't have to talk about real numbers here, but I think what a lot of people in the on-demand space are trying to accomplish now that we live in a world that's seeking profitability rather than growth is potentially stacking orders. Instead of having one person delivering one burger, it's how can we stack as much as possible to spread this delivery cost across a few different orders. That feels like something that's naturally solved by B2B as well, because you're naturally stacking orders, and therefore it could be a much more profitable part of the food delivery industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Where it makes sense for both delivery optimization and food quality, we will stack orders appropriately. I think another huge advantage when it comes to profitability on the B2B side is simply just the order size. We're not having to deliver 2 burgers and have an individual who is delivering that and make that individual transaction profitable. But instead, if you're delivering 200 burgers and you're having one individual deliver that, the numbers match up in a way which is a lot more profitable there.
Yeah. And then just to double click on the sustainability element, how much influence do you exert on your restaurant partners? Can you convince them to stop using styrofoam and plastics and that kind of thing?
Yeah, fantastic question. How much influence do we have? I like to think quite a lot, but we certainly can't force anything upon them. It's about how do we incentivize them and encourage them and inform them about some really great options that we have. So there's a few different partnerships that we can use the size of our company for to get good deals for our restaurants and that kind of thing. A couple examples of that are we have a fantastic partnership with Notpla, who recently won the Moonshot Prize. They're a biodegradable seaweed packaging, which is disrupting kind of the plastic space. And so we have a partnership with them in which we're able to then provide that and advertise that to our restaurant partners. And similarly, we have a partnership on the flip side with Club Zero, which rather than pursuing biodegradable packaging is pursuing reusable packaging instead. So that's a really cool option where restaurants will sign up to that. They get packaging. They will deliver the food in the reusable packaging, which is then subsequently collected at the customer's office after lunchtime, ready to be rewashed and used again multiple times. So there's effectively zero waste.
Nice. In our first episode, we were talking about how there used to be this very traditional logistics model of packages coming in from outside of town, sortation facility on the outside of town into home, and that was the end of the loop. Today, we're seeing a lot more logistics within the cities, and that's a perfect example, right? Where the first mile is often back at the customer site. There's a lot more pickups. There's a lot more logistics happening within the city that again requires more nimble logistics methods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing I would add on the sustainability as well is because it's become so much more of a talking point, what's great is actually diving into the data on it. And so one key area is obviously the delivery side and where possible swapping to green vehicles, low or zero emission vehicles. By doing the data, what we can actually see is that the transport side is a relatively low portion of the emissions when somebody's placing a food delivery order. So the substantial bulk of the emissions will actually be from the food choices that an individual is making as well. So whether you're choosing, a plant-based burger versus a beef burger is far more impactful than whether your food delivery is being delivered by a petrol motorbike or a cycle.
Mm. And is that something you advertise to then consumer? Your food generated this amount of, as grams of CO2 output?
Yeah, it's something we're having a lot of conversations about.
Yeah.
So when certain customers come to us and we're having conversations about sustainability with them, we can actually show them the data around this is how much of your office is ordering vegetarian versus vegan versus pesky versus meat. And this is the impact that has on your emissions. So we've done some fun challenges with some customers where they go no meat on a Monday or that kind of thing, or plant-based for a week, especially over January, for example, for the Veganuary campaign. Those are really fun and quite impactful. And then we also try and work with restaurants to ensure that the offering that they have caters to all the different dietaries. We've also just launched a trial, actually, in a few different restaurant partners, where if the consumer is actually browsing the menu for a restaurant, they will be able to see a 1 to 5 score as to the emissions that particular item has. So naturally, that goes from green to red. It's similar to when supermarkets brought in the green to red on fats and protein and salts and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I'd love for us to be at the forefront of that change. hopefully eventually towards legislation, where in the same way that food products require a red to green score of fats, I think we should have the same thing for emissions.
That's powerful. You have a very powerful voice in the room in terms of education, where you don't want to force this thing down people's throats. But I think a lot of people don't realize the actual. It's hard to compare things that are negative, and so we consider a petrol moped as negative, and consider a steak as a at least a carbon negative. But you're saying, one of these is actually hugely differential to the other, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. And so you have a very powerful voice in the room for that.
I think so as well. I think, we tend to talk about just the logistic side of emissions.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, Michael, that you're actually at the forefront of making people think and educate themselves around different things. And as organisations, we can change it. If we're going to have a lunch, perhaps a vegan-free lunch. A vegan lunch is a good thing to do. The other thing, Nicholas, for me is how impactful this B2B market is compared with the B2C market on sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
And it's perhaps something we can pick up when we next talk about customer demands in the B2C, see what the difference is between sustainability visions in both environments. I think we might find that totally different.
Yeah. And which kind of customer has more appetite for caring about sustainability? I think what we hear time and time again is that if you put a survey in front of someone, they will happily say that they really care about sustainability. And then when you ask them, or you try to charge them for the more sustainable solution, that desire evaporates quickly.
It does.
When it's a question of cost.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I think on the side of B2B, what's quite exciting is it's at lunch for a very specific period of time. And so what we actually see when we talk to a lot of the individuals that are eating the orders is that they'll maybe make a different choice for their business paid for lunch versus what they're going for at dinner when they're a bit more tired and at home. And so people might be a bit more flexible in terms of choosing beef or less sustainable options in the evening. But when they're at the office, there's a lot more, I think, of a desire to be like, I'll be healthy, I'll go for the zero emission option, and I'll choose a salad. And so, you see a big difference there, B2C versus B2B.
Everyone's virtue signaling at the office.
Yeah, I think so.
So now we've got the calories on there, we've got the greens and salts and pieces. Now we've got the emissions part, which would be super powerful.
Yeah.
Super powerful. Great. That's really interesting. Something I've not thought about before. I'm sure other people haven't. In terms of your market and business to business, we talk about changing cities, we talk about congestion, emissions, and a healthy environment for everybody to live in. What do you think in terms of that B2B market, if you're looking forward in the next 12, 24 months? What do you think those key challenges are for you to be able to continue to deliver that fantastic service to your customers?
Yeah, well, I think the clear thing is that petrol's out. That's for sure. I anticipate that it won't be long before, if it's not through legislation within London, for example, I anticipate that just there's a customer demand change. And we're definitely seeing the pivot where it's actually just more efficient and more economic to be delivering with zero emission vehicles. So that's going to be a huge change. And then with that comes how a city is actually choosing to facilitate the rise of the ultra low emission vehicle, essentially. At the moment, you see this kind of challenge where cargo bikes are a bit unsure. Do they drive in the bike lane or do they drive on the road with the cars? And the cyclists get frustrated at them when they're a little bit wide in the bike lane, and the cars get frustrated at them weaving in and out. And I think cities really need to think very carefully about the future of roads, essentially, and how they are choosing to build those to cater for the vehicles of the future. And that includes also when you're building offices and considering how are vehicles accessing office. Are they what we typically find is if it's a bicycle or a cargo bike, they're pulling up at the front door to the reception. But if it's a petrol vehicle, they're allowed into the loading bay in order to deliver the food through that entrance. And really, why is there a difference there? They're both ultimately delivering goods. And so, we need to think about that. But I see a huge shift towards emission free.
And I know you're a keen cyclist, so that piece around cycling lanes in London is an interesting fact, isn't it? You know, cargo bikes are bikes. You know, they can go in those bike lanes. But from a personal point of view, are you seeing more cargo bikes around the streets when you're cycling?
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge. 3 years ago, it was incredibly rare to see a cargo bike. And now I'm cycling along, I see them everywhere. There's so many different new companies and new partners that are popping up, and there's new brands of cargo bikes. And I think we're at the cusp of this big explosion, I think, of all these different cargo bikes. Which one's going to win out in terms of the brand and the mechanics? And you're seeing ones that have huge top boxes on the back of them, ones which have boxes on the front. They're doing everything from flower deliveries to farmer to food. It's, yeah, I think it's growing fast.
Love to hear that. Our whole third episode was with Nigel, the chairman of EAV, who make the four wheeler with a big box on the back. And so we had a nice long chat about cargo bikes specifically. Sitting in London, we sometimes overemphasize and talk mostly about London. So what's the scope of what you think about? Is it largely just cities? And if it's just cities, is it London? Are you also thinking internationally? How does that work?
Yeah, the focus is primarily on London. Certainly at Just Eat for Business, we operate across the whole of UK and Ireland, and Just Eat takeaway groups in multiple markets across the world. My personal focus tends to be here in London. The reason for that is that's where you see the bulk of the group deliveries. Whilst there is certainly B2B food offering and demand outside, it tends to come more with individual ordering. So, for example, it could be a company which wants to offer a perk to their staff when they find themselves working late. And so that's still very much a B2B offering, but it comes in the form of on-demand, small basket size food delivery, whilst it's mainly the big towns and places like London, which is offering a recurring team meal every day or every week.
Because you need a certain critical mass to get to justify that kind of larger order.
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the interesting things that Paul McCormick brought up on our second episode around micro fulfillment centers is I tend to think about parcels and the kinds of things that you operate. And he brought up ghost kitchens, which in my mind aren't quite a fulfillment center, but now reflecting back on it, I think that makes sense. Wondering what you're seeing in terms of trends in the ghost kitchen space. What do you have a sense as to what percentage of the restaurants that you work with are just ghost kitchens, and is that increasing or decreasing?
I feel that there was a really big boom on ghost kitchens or dark kitchens and all the other terms a few years ago, but it does seem to that excitement that was really around 2 years ago or so seems to be on the decrease.
Okay.
I definitely see huge advantages about it, in terms of you essentially just having a kitchen which is set up and optimized for delivery, so it can churn out the food that's relevant to the catchment area that it's in. It's optimized to minimize the wait times for riders when they're collecting. It must be I know it's so much harder to run a restaurant which is both of those things, having to handle customers in store as well as drivers coming in and out. We often see a challenge there. I know that there is certainly dark kitchens or delivery only kitchens on our platform, but it's not taking the rise that I maybe thought it would have done a few years ago. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Very interesting. I think when we come about dot warehouses or dot fulfillment, dot kitchens become one of those things that's in my mind as well. But you're saying that's pretty leveled out or is going backwards, yeah?
Yeah, that's what I've seen in my own observation. I think it works really well perhaps in your satellite areas. So if you're in a business park, for example, outside of Central, but for us, the significant majority of the noise is coming from Central, and there we find that we're working with brands that are most commonly you're picking up food from stores that are also serving customers in store.
Great. And I think in our cities, just thinking aloud, is we've got now a situation where we are producing products in cities, whether that dark kitchens or restaurants, and we're delivering in there. So we're both doing the collection and the delivery without any micro fulfillment that we talked about on previous episodes. So there is a whole world there of logistics movements that need to be catered for in our cities.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to tie back just to one of the first things we talked about, if you don't mind, of kind of this. Okay, the order's been placed. Now you push it out to the correct delivery model for that order. I love to say that or talk about the ways that cargo bikes are faster and cheaper. Obviously, at a certain point, if the order is big enough, you're also talking about vans. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of factors in that decision around kind of vehicle optimization?
Yeah, I can touch on it a little bit.
Okay.
I suppose any order that comes in, there's a number of different data points, which could be the postcode, the distance that order is traveling, who's the customer that's ordering it, are they a repeat customer, do they have certain expectations around what vehicle type is actually delivering their order, and
So
where
the
are they
customers,
ordering
when they're
from?
signing up with you, they're saying, "Hey, we actually have a preference for this kind of vehicle." That's one of the points.
Yeah, it could well be part of the discussion as part of onboarding. Generally, we are customers away from the notion that they can decide, because they could end up choosing options which are ultimately less reliable.
Yeah.
And our goal, first and foremost, is to get the food on time and in full, i.e., no problems with the order to the customer. And so reliability comes first. But where possible, if there are customers that are particularly green on their agenda, we want to be able to honor that. If there's customers that have particularly complex security access, then we need to consider that in terms of who is ultimately going to be fulfilling that order as well.
Great.
And I've got one last question, I think, in terms of, as people are coming back to work, in the larger office areas, they had their own restaurant facilities. Do you think that's going to come back, or do you think the ability to be able to order in a variety of things when you need it is really what your business model's about?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Certainly before COVID, there were a lot of offices which had restaurants on site. There was your in-house catering, canteen kind of model. And I certainly think that that's here to stay to an extent, and it makes sense in some environments. But what we've seen post-COVID is quite a big shift towards customers and offices wanting a delivered-in solution that provides far more variety, far better quality, and actually at a great price point as well. If your goal is team engagement, building culture, and fostering relationships, having that delivered in is just far more exciting for the team. In addition, when in the post-COVID world, you've got volatile headcounts, you're not exactly sure how many people are turning up to your office each day because of hybrid working, what you see is a lot of companies no longer want to pay for the rent that comes with in-house canteens. And actually, you can get rid of that whole canteen space, recoup all that cash, and have a delivered-in solution instead.
Interesting. I saw that movement away. So we talk about numbers a lot, and previously we talked about 11 million packages, which are network packages being delivered a day. In terms of, I often think about this in London. You may know the answer. If you don't, it's fine. I'll just go ask somebody else until I find the answer. But how many people have lunch in London?
A lot of people are having lunch. I can tell you a lot of people are having it every single day and eating together.
Do you mean how many are getting delivered?
Just how many people are working in London? And if we work in London, I'm picking on London because we're talking about that, but how many people have lunch?
Well, surely most of them. And we can just look up the population of London, right?
I hope everybody is.
Yeah, but the population's not necessarily the working population.
True. They're definitely commuters that commute in.
So people are coming into London,
Yeah.
hopefully by train and sustainable transport, and we're finding that. But they come into London, there's a food requirement in London.
Yeah.
It'd be great to get some statistics on that.
Well, I'd love to know what percentage of those are delivered as well.
Yeah.
And the B2C versus B2B split.
Yeah, I mean, the catering industry, it's multi-billion-dollar industry, isn't it? So, yeah, there's a lot more of that pie to eat up.
Great. Growth potential for you, Mark.
Yeah. Michael, I want to say a huge thank you for coming on. I think historically we've largely focused on parcel delivery and that whole logistics chain. And so it was really interesting to get your take on the food space, and not just general food delivery, but specifically B2B food delivery, and the nuances between B2B and B2C, how those work differently with the customers, how those work differently from a stacking standpoint, how COVID has changed that space, how you are a tool for getting people back into the office, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, and the role that Just Eat plays on the sustainability side, how you can guide people's decisions towards potentially decreasing carbon output per order. Also really excited to see your excitement around cargo bikes. Both it feels like personal and commercial. Big thank you to everyone who's joined today. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see everyone next week.